Edward Lancaster jolted awake, his senses tingling with the uncanny awareness of being watched. The clock by his bedside read 2:17 a.m., and the silence inside the mansion was heavy. He lay still, straining to catch the faintest sound. Then, there it was again, a rustle of paper, the distinct sound of a drawer closing softly. The noises were coming from his study, the one place he considered his sanctuary, filled with private documents and memories he hadn't touched in years. Throwing on his robe, Edward slipped out of bed and down the hall, his heart hammering as he approached the doorway. As he pushed the door open, Edward's eyes locked onto a man sitting behind his desk. The stranger's hands rested on an open photo album, flipping through its pages with a quiet reverence. His face was mostly in shadow, but when he looked up, the light caught his features, and Edward froze. The man had dark hair, streaked with the faintest hint of gray, and eyes that shone with a haunting familiarity. "Edward," the man said, his voice low and steady. "It's me. It's Robert." Edward's breath caught in his throat. Robert? The name alone was enough to bring back a torrent of memories, long buried. Robert had been his younger brother, lost in a car accident nearly 30 years ago. The details of that night had been murky. An explosion, a wrecked vehicle, no survivors, but Edward had been forced to accept it. They had buried an empty casket. "You're lying," Edward finally managed, his voice sharper than he intended. "Robert died. Decades ago. Whoever you are, you need to leave." The man, this so-called Robert, stared back at him with an unflinching gaze. "I understand why you don't believe me," he said, his voice laced with sadness. "But I assure you, it's me. Look at me, Edward. Really look." Against his better judgment, Edward let his eyes linger on the man's face, studying the details more closely. He had Robert's same high cheekbones, his slightly uneven eyebrows, even a faint scar near his temple from a bike accident they'd had as children. The resemblance was undeniable, but Edward's rational mind resisted. It had to be some kind of ruse. "Explain yourself," Edward demanded, feeling the weight of his past stirring within him. "If you really are Robert, where have you been all this time? Why now?" The man looked away, his expression darkening. "I wish I could answer that," he said quietly. "All I remember from that night is a flash of light, the feeling of being thrown from the car, and then darkness. When I woke up, I was in a village miles away. They told me I was the only one they found. I didn't know who I was. The doctors said I had trauma-induced amnesia. It was only recently that my memory started returning, and by then, it was too late. I'd missed so much. But I had to find you." Edward's mind swam, caught between disbelief and something he dared not name. "Hope. Amnesia?" he repeated skeptically, leaning against the desk, his voice wavering. "You expect me to believe that you just forgot who you were? All these years, you've been alive and never thought to come back?" The man met his eyes with a mixture of desperation and defiance. "You're right to doubt me, Edward. But think about it. If I wanted to harm you or take something from you, why would I come in the middle of the night? Why would I risk everything by being here at all?" That gave Edward pause. He looked down at the album on his desk, one he hadn't opened in years. It was filled with old family photographs, mostly from their childhood. As he studied the images, memories of his brother began to flood back. Moments of laughter, arguments, shared secrets. Edward could almost feel the echo of their bond. And yet, this could easily be some cruel trick. "I need proof," Edward said, hardening his gaze. "Tell me something only Robert would know. Tell me something from our childhood, something no one else could possibly know." The man, or Robert, nodded slowly, as if he had expected this. "When we were kids, you had a secret hiding spot in the attic," he began, his voice soft, almost nostalgic. "You'd stash sweets there because Mother wouldn't let you eat them. I found it one day, and instead of tattling, I joined you. We'd sneak up there and eat licorice and chocolates until we were sick. And you called it our safe house." A jolt of recognition hit Edward so hard that he had to grip the edge of the desk to steady himself. That was something he had shared only with Robert, a silly, cherished memory from their youth. No one else knew about it. "I don't believe this," Edward whispered, though his voice lacked conviction. There has to be some other explanation. Robert stepped forward, his face earnest and pleading. Please, Edward. I've missed my own family, my home. I've missed you, more than you can know. I just want to know what's left for me here. A rush of conflicting emotions surged within Edward. He had spent years mourning the loss of his brother, building an empire in an effort to fill the void Robert had left behind. Now, here he was, claiming to be the same person Edward had buried in his memory, perhaps as a way to survive the grief. Why now? Edward asked again, his voice barely above a whisper. After all this time, why now? Robert's gaze flickered with an emotion Edward couldn't place. Because I couldn't live in the dark anymore. Because I felt it was time to find out who I really was. To know my family, and to know what became of you. I came here hoping we could at least start again. Edward was silent, struggling to keep his emotions in check. The possibility of Robert's return was a miracle he had once longed for. But now, after so many years, it felt like an unhealed wound being ripped open. If Robert was truly back, it would change everything he thought he knew. Finally, Edward took a deep breath and straightened, nodding. I need answers, he said, voice steady but laced with quiet intensity. I'll give you a chance to prove who you are, Robert. But understand this. If this is some trick, you'll regret it. Robert's expression softened, and he nodded. Fair enough, he replied. I wouldn't expect anything less. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of years hanging heavily between them. Edward felt as though he were on the edge of a cliff, staring down at a reunion that was equal parts thrilling and terrifying. Yet, there was no turning back now. As dawn's first light crept through the window, Edward knew one thing for certain. His life would never be the same again. Edward Lancaster had barely slept. His thoughts were tangled in a web of doubt, disbelief, and reluctant hope. Morning sunlight crept into his bedroom, casting pale slants across the walls, but nothing about the new day offered clarity. Had Robert truly returned, or was this some elaborate trick? Edward's heart leaned toward the former, but years of ruthlessly navigating high society and cutthroat business had taught him to trust only cold, hard evidence. After a quick breakfast, Edward made a decision. He needed the truth. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. Jonathan Marks speaking. A voice on the other end answered. Jonathan was a skilled private investigator, a man Edward had once relied on for corporate intelligence and, years ago, had even consulted to look into Robert's supposed death. Jonathan, it's Edward Lancaster. I need your help with something unusual. Jonathan didn't hesitate. Of course, Edward. What can I do? Edward's grip on the phone tightened. I need you to look into someone claiming to be my brother, Robert. He's back after nearly 3 decades. It could be a deception, or worse. Jonathan let out a low whistle. Robert? As in, the brother who died? Yes. Find anything you can on him from the last 30 years. I need to know who he really is, where he's been, and if it's truly possible he's my brother. The two agreed to meet later that evening to discuss any initial findings, but as Edward hung up, he knew he couldn't wait passively for answers. He needed to face Robert again and press him for the truth. Downstairs in the living room, Robert stood gazing out at the sprawling gardens, hands tucked in his pockets. He looked as if he belonged there, comfortable and somehow familiar in the Lancaster home, which only served to unsettle Edward further. Did you sleep well? Edward asked, his tone guarded. Robert turned, a faint smile on his lips. I never thought I'd sleep in this house again. Just seeing it brings back memories. He gestured toward the garden. Remember when we used to sneak out here and play by the lake? Mother would scold us for getting our clothes muddy, but we never cared. Edward stiffened. The memory stirred something within him, an image of simpler days before wealth and power had consumed his life. A lot has changed since then, he said curtly. I've called an investigator. He'll look into your story, and until I'm convinced, you'll stay here under my watch. Robert nodded, his gaze somber. I understand. I don't expect you to take my word on faith alone. The morning dragged on, each conversation with Robert dredging up more memories. Robert spoke of their mother's laugh, their father's stern expectations, and the small rebellions they'd shared as children. Edward listened, searching for inconsistencies, but every word Robert spoke only deepened his belief. He could feel the weight of the years that had passed and the bittersweet ache of their lost bond. But when Edward brought up the night of Robert's supposed death, his brother's face grew dark and his words faltered. "There was so much chaos," Robert murmured, his hands clenched. "I don't remember much after the crash. I only know I woke up in a small clinic, far from the wreckage, with a fractured memory and no identification. They told me I was lucky to be alive. Why didn't you come back sooner?" Edward pressed. "If you're really my brother, why didn't you try to return?" Robert's gaze fell. "I didn't know who I was. I didn't even remember my own name. I drifted from place to place, working odd jobs to survive. It wasn't until a few years ago that fragments of my memory began to return. Faces, names. I'd see images of you, of this house, but it was all so hazy." He looked up, eyes fierce with emotion. "I came back as soon as I could, Edward. As soon as I knew." The sincerity in Robert's voice was like a knife to Edward's resolve. Could it really be possible? Could he have lost his brother all those years ago, only to have him return now, like a miracle? Yet, just as he was on the verge of accepting it, the doorbell rang, snapping him back to reality. Jonathan Marks stepped inside, nodding politely as Edward ushered him into the study. His expression was serious, his eyes darting briefly to Robert before settling on Edward. "Thank you for coming," Edward said. "What have you found?" Jonathan took a seat, adjusting his glasses. "It's unusual, to say the least. The accident report from that night was incomplete. It states that a body was never conclusively identified. The car was registered to Robert Lancaster, but the person at the scene was declared dead due to the extent of injuries and the lack of ID. However," he paused, glancing at Robert, "there were inconsistencies in the investigation." Edward's brow furrowed. "What inconsistencies?" Jonathan opened a file, extracting a few sheets of paper. Witnesses reported seeing a second figure near the scene before the police arrived, someone who may have fled after the crash. This detail was buried in the report. No further mention of it, no follow-up. Robert leaned forward, his face pale. "So someone was there?" Jonathan nodded. "It's possible. I also looked into local hospital records from that night. A man matching Robert's description was admitted to a rural clinic miles from the crash site. Unidentified, in critical condition. That could be him." Edward's mind spun. If there had been another person, someone who could have pulled Robert from the wreckage and left him stranded with no memory, then perhaps his story was true. And yet, the realization brought no relief, only dread. "There's more," Jonathan continued, voice low. "After he was released, he vanished without a trace. His medical records stop abruptly. It's as if he disappeared." The words hung heavily in the room. Edward glanced at Robert, whose face reflected a mixture of anguish and confusion. "Do you remember anyone else from that night?" Edward asked quietly. "Anyone who might have helped you?" Robert shook his head slowly. "Nothing clear. It's like trying to grasp fog. I remember a man's voice, rough and hurried, but I don't know who he was." The three men fell silent, each lost in their thoughts. Finally, Edward spoke, his voice edged with bitterness. "If you're Robert, then someone took you from me that night and kept you from returning. And if that's true," he clenched his fists, "I need to know who did this and why." The investigation would have to continue, but Edward knew that there was only one person left who could shed light on Robert's strange return. His own estranged son, Leo, who had long resented Edward's authority and felt disconnected from the Lancaster legacy. If Robert was to truly be accepted, Edward needed Leo to be a part of this reunion, to share in the decision of whether or not this man was truly Robert. Hours later, as evening approached, Edward called Leo, feeling the familiar tension creep into his voice. "Leo, I need you to come to the estate. There's something you need to see." There was a brief pause on the line. "Is this another lecture on family duty?" Leo's tone was laced with sarcasm, but Edward ignored it. "No, it's something different. It's about your Uncle Robert." Silence followed his words, and after a moment, Leo muttered, "Uncle Robert? Dad, he died when I was a kid." "Just come, Leo," Edward replied, his voice heavy. You need to see this for yourself. As he hung up, Edward felt the weight of what lay ahead pressing on him. Soon, Leo would arrive, and Edward would have to face the implications of Robert's return with his son by his side. But even as he waited, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning, that secrets far darker than he'd imagined lay hidden in the shadows of his family's past. And with Robert's reappearance, those secrets were about to be unearthed. As dusk settled over the Lancaster estate, Edward stood by the window in his study, watching the road for any sign of Leo's arrival. His thoughts were a tangle of apprehension and disbelief. Bringing Leo into this situation would be difficult. His son had always been distant, disapproving of Edward's methods and the rigid rules that had governed his life. Yet, Edward knew Leo had a right to be here. If Robert's return was real, it would change everything about their family, especially for Leo, who had grown up idolizing his lost uncle from the stories Edward had told him. At last, headlights sliced through the approaching darkness. Leo's car wound up the long driveway, stopping just outside the front door. Edward felt a knot in his stomach as he watched his son climb out, his expression guarded. Leo was in his early 30s now, with sharp features and the unmistakable confidence that came from being raised with wealth and expectation. But tonight, there was a cautious look in his eyes, as if he suspected his father's call was a ploy. "Leo," Edward greeted, stepping out to meet him. "Thank you for coming." Leo's eyes narrowed. "Is this another attempt to drag me into the Lancaster Empire? Because if it is, you can spare me the lecture." Edward held up a hand. "No lectures tonight. This is different. Just come inside. There's someone you need to meet." Curiosity flickered in Leo's expression as he followed Edward into the grand, dimly lit hall. He stopped short when he saw the man standing by the fireplace. Robert turned, his face illuminated by the firelight, and Leo's eyes widened. "Who is this?" Leo asked, his voice laced with disbelief as he looked from Robert to Edward. Edward took a deep breath, struggling to keep his own voice steady. "Leo, this is your uncle, Robert." Leo's face shifted between confusion and shock. He took a step back, then laughed bitterly. "You're joking. Uncle Robert? He's been dead since I was a kid. You expect me to believe this man is my uncle?" Robert's expression softened, and he took a step forward. "Leo, I know this is hard to believe, but it's me. I may not look exactly the way I did in the photos you saw as a boy, but I'm still the same Robert." But Leo's jaw clenched, his eyes dark with suspicion. "And where have you been, then? Are you telling me you just wandered off and decided to come back after 3 decades? Edward intervened, explaining the story Robert had shared about the crash, the amnesia, and the years he had spent piecing his life together before regaining his memory. Leo listened, arms crossed, an unreadable expression on his face. "You really expect me to buy this?" Leo muttered, turning to Edward. "Dad, I thought you were smarter than this. This could be some con artist, someone who's found out about our family history and wants to take advantage of you." Edward bristled, but Robert simply nodded. "You have every reason to be skeptical, Leo. I'd probably react the same way if I were in your shoes. But if there's any part of you that believes I could be who I say I am, let me prove it." Leo's gaze flickered with something like pity before he masked it. "Fine. Prove it. Tell me something about my father that only you'd know." Robert's eyes softened, and he met Edward's gaze before speaking. "Your father once climbed the town's water tower just to hang a banner for Mother's birthday. He was terrified of heights, but he did it anyway, and he wouldn't let anyone else help him." Leo looked at Edward, who nodded slowly, his own mouth drawn in a line of grim acceptance. The memory was true, a moment from their youth that no one else knew about. "Is that proof enough for you?" Edward asked Leo quietly, feeling the weight of the truth settling around them. Leo's eyes flickered with doubt and confusion. He took a step back, pacing the length of the room as he processed what he'd just heard. Finally, he stopped and looked at Robert, his gaze piercing. "Okay," he said slowly, "maybe you're him. But if you are, then there's something you should explain. Why were you so reckless with your life that night? You left my dad to build this empire on his own while he thought you were dead." Robert's face fell, a mix of regret and sorrow clouding his features. I was young, Leo, and I made mistakes. I didn't understand what I had until it was gone. But being lost for so many years has shown me just how much I left behind, and how much I want to make it right. The answer seemed to soften something in Leo, though his expression remained guarded. He took a seat by the fire, glancing from Robert to Edward. "So, what now?" Leo asked, his tone challenging. "You let him stay here? Bring him into our lives as if nothing happened?" Edward exhaled slowly, still grappling with his own emotions. "I don't know what the future holds, Leo, but I do know that if he is truly my brother, he deserves a place here. And he deserves a second chance." The room fell into silence, the only sound the soft crackle of the fire. Then, Robert cleared his throat, his gaze steady. "There's something I should tell you both," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Something I've remembered about that night." Edward and Leo looked at him, both bracing for what was to come. "There was a man at the crash site. I don't know who he was, but he pulled me from the wreckage. I remember his voice, rough and hurried. He told me to lie still, that he would make sure I was taken care of. And then, I lost consciousness again. When I woke up, I was alone, miles away, with no idea who I was." Edward's jaw clenched as anger simmered beneath the surface. "So, someone knew you survived and left you there to rot?" Robert nodded, his face somber. "I believe so. And whoever did that went to great lengths to make sure I never came back. I don't know why, but I intend to find out. Someone wanted me gone, and they almost succeeded." Leo frowned, his gaze intense. "You're saying someone tried to destroy our family? Someone from our past?" Edward nodded grimly. "That's exactly what he's saying. And if he's right, then this goes deeper than I ever imagined." Robert looked from Edward to Leo, his expression one of quiet determination. "I didn't come back just to reclaim my life. I came back to make sure the truth is uncovered. And if that means facing our family's darkest secrets, then so be it." Edward and Leo exchanged a glance, both of them understanding that Robert's return was not just a personal reckoning, but the beginning of a dangerous path into the shadows of their family's history. They would need each other to face what lay ahead, but the question remained. Could they truly trust each other, or would the secrets of the past tear them apart? The Lancaster legacy, built on decades of wealth, power, and privilege, was about to be shaken to its very core. As the days passed, the Lancaster mansion grew heavy with unspoken questions. The old estate seemed almost alive, its long corridors echoing with memories and secrets long buried. Edward spent his days juggling the daily operations of the family empire while grappling with Robert's sudden reappearance. Leo stayed close by, wary of his uncle's motives, but his curiosity was undeniable. They all felt that Robert's return was more than a miracle. It was a mystery waiting to unravel. One evening, Edward decided to check on a few old belongings stashed in the attic. He hadn't been up there in years. As he climbed the narrow staircase, dust and cobwebs surrounded him, and the air was thick and musty. Boxes of family heirlooms were piled haphazardly in the dim light, but Edward was drawn to an old trunk near the back wall, half hidden by a faded sheet. He lifted the lid and found layers of forgotten mementos. His mother's music box, a collection of postcards from their childhood vacations, and, buried underneath, a leather-bound album. Its pages held faded photos from the early years of his and Robert's lives. Flipping through it, he felt the pang of nostalgia mixed with a sadness he couldn't shake. Then he saw it, their mother's portrait, carefully preserved in an ornate, golden frame. A shiver ran down his spine as he looked at her image. Their mother had always been a guiding force in their lives, a presence both gentle and wise. After her untimely passing, her portrait had been put away, and Edward had thought it lost. Yet, here it was, staring back at him as if she, too, had been waiting for this moment. Edward sat for a while in silence, his fingers tracing the edges of the frame. The memories of his mother felt strangely close, as if she were watching over him now, silently urging him to find peace with Robert's return. But as he stared, questions stirred inside him. His mother had been devoted to their family, yet there had always been things he didn't fully understand, secrets she had kept. He heard footsteps behind him, and turning, saw Robert standing at the entrance to the attic, watching him. "Couldn't sleep?" Robert asked, a faint smile on his lips. Edward nodded, placing the album back in the trunk. "I wanted to check on some old things. I found Mother's portrait." He held it up, letting Robert see. Robert's eyes softened as he approached, gazing at the image with reverence. "She looks just as I remember. Kind, strong. She would have wanted us to be here together." Edward's throat tightened. "I know, but I keep wondering what she would have thought about the mess our lives became after that night." They stood in silence, the shadows of the attic cloaking them, until Leo's voice echoed from behind them. "Didn't know this was a family reunion." Leo stepped into the attic, crossing his arms as he surveyed his father and uncle with a mix of skepticism and curiosity. Edward felt a pang of guilt. Leo had never known their mother's love or guidance. All Leo had seen were two men who let a lifetime of separation build walls between them. "This portrait," Leo said, stepping closer. "She looks so serene. But I wonder what secrets she knew that we didn't." Edward exchanged a glance with Robert. "What do you mean?" Leo shrugged, but his expression was serious. "There are too many things about our family that don't add up. This whole situation. Robert's disappearance, your reappearance. It's like pieces of a puzzle we can't see yet. And if someone wanted to erase you, Uncle Robert, maybe it's connected to this whole legacy." Edward's heart sank. Leo's words resonated with his own growing suspicions. Was it possible their mother had known more about the dangers facing their family? Could the Lancaster legacy be built on something more than ambition and fortune? Robert, who had been staring intently at the portrait, looked at Leo. "Our mother did know things, Leo. I'm sure of it. She was always so careful, always urging us to be wary of those who got too close to our family. I never thought much of it then, but now, I wonder if she had good reason." Leo's gaze darkened. "Then maybe it's time we find out what those reasons were." They spent the rest of the evening sifting through the attic, poring over old letters, diaries, and photos, searching for any clue that might reveal the hidden truths their mother had guarded. Finally, buried in the bottom of a worn box, they found something peculiar. A letter sealed with the family crest, addressed to Edward and Robert. Edward's hands trembled as he carefully broke the seal, unfolding the brittle paper. The handwriting was unmistakable, the flowing script of their mother. "My dear sons, if you are reading this, then I am no longer with you, and the burden of our family's secrets has fallen to you both. There are things you must know, things I could never tell you directly, for fear that speaking them aloud would only endanger you. Our wealth, our empire. It was built on alliances and promises made long before either of you were born. These alliances have kept us safe, but they have also bound us to powerful people who will stop at nothing to control what we possess. Should you ever find yourselves in danger, trust no one blindly. Keep your loyalty within the family and guard each other. You are stronger together than apart. All my love, Mother." The letter fell silent, but its warning echoed in their minds. Edward looked at Robert, who was pale, his jaw clenched in fury. "Alliances and promises," Robert muttered. She knew. She knew someone was waiting for a chance to destroy us." Leo stared at the letter, his expression conflicted. "So that's it? Our family's wealth comes with a curse? And we're supposed to just carry on as if it's normal?" Edward sighed, the weight of his mother's words pressing down on him. "It's not a curse, Leo. It's a legacy. And I've always believed that what we built was worth protecting. But I won't lie to you. There are shadows over our past that I never wanted you to know." Leo's face hardened. "Well, now I know. And I'm not willing to let our family's secrets destroy us. We need to dig deeper, find out who's behind this, and why they tried to erase Robert." Robert nodded. "Leo's right. Someone wants our family's empire, and they nearly succeeded in taking me out of the picture. But we still have an advantage. They don't know I've returned. Not yet." Edward looked between his son and his brother, seeing the same fire of determination reflected in both their eyes. "Then we work together," he said, voice firm. "We protect what's ours and we uncover the truth, no matter what it takes." As they left the attic, a sense of resolve settled over them. For the first time in years, Edward felt united with both his son and his brother, bound by the task ahead of them. There was no turning back now. But even as he walked down the shadowed hall, Edward felt the chill of the unknown lurking just out of sight. The Lancaster family had always been bound by secrets, but now, with Robert's return, those secrets had risen from the grave, demanding to be faced. And whatever lay in their family's dark past, Edward knew it was only a matter of time before it caught up with them all. Tensions simmered in the Lancaster mansion as days passed. Edward, Robert, and Leo had formed an uneasy alliance, determined to uncover the truth behind the family's hidden alliances and the attempt on Robert's life. Yet, even as they worked together, old rivalries and suspicions lingered beneath the surface, threatening to fracture their unity. Edward and Robert, once close as brothers, found themselves at odds as they pieced together their family's shadowed history. For years, Edward had built the Lancaster Empire on his own, driven by his desire to honor the family legacy in Robert's absence. But now, with Robert back, the balance of power was shifting, and neither brother was willing to yield easily. The turning point came when Robert proposed an idea. They were gathered in Edward's study, the dim light casting their faces in shadows, an atmosphere thick with unspoken grievances and unhealed wounds. "I think it's time we make a public announcement about my return," Robert said, his tone firm. "We can use it to our advantage, to draw out whoever is responsible for trying to get rid of me in the first place. If they know I'm alive, they might make a move." Edward's expression darkened. "Absolutely not. The last thing we need is to invite attention to a family matter that's already volatile enough. We can handle this discreetly." Robert scoffed, crossing his arms. "Discreetly? You think hiding away in this mansion is going to solve everything? Edward, someone wants us broken, probably dead, and you think playing it safe will keep us out of danger?" Leo, watching the exchange from the side, interjected, "I have to agree with Uncle Robert. Whoever's behind this has been operating in the shadows. If we force them into the open, we'll at least have a better idea of who we're dealing with." But Edward shook his head. "This isn't just about our safety. It's about our reputation, our name. Making a spectacle out of Robert's return could jeopardize everything we've worked for. We could lose our partner's trust and expose ourselves to the very people who want to see us fail." Robert's gaze hardened. "Our name? Or is it your pride, Edward? You've spent so long building this empire alone that you can't bear the thought of me coming back and claiming my place." Edward felt his anger flare. "You think I wanted this? I had no choice, Robert. I had to build this family's legacy on my own while you were gone, without knowing if you were alive or dead. And now you want to waltz in and act like nothing's changed?" Their words hung in the air, sharp as knives. Leo watched them, his jaw clenched, caught between the two sides of his family. For as long as he could remember, Edward had held absolute control over the family empire, ruling with an iron will. But Robert's return had thrown everything into turmoil, and Leo could see that his father's refusal to share power wasn't just about caution. It was about control. "Both of you are missing the point," Leo said finally, his voice calm but resolute. "We need a clear plan, and we need to work together. This isn't about who's in charge or whose legacy matters most. This is about protecting our family from whoever's behind this." Robert looked at Leo, his face softening. "You're right, Leo. The only way forward is together." He shot a challenging look at Edward. "But we need to stop hiding and take the fight to them." Edward's expression shifted, and for a moment, Leo thought his father would refuse. But Edward surprised them both by nodding, his face grim. "Fine. If we do this, we'll do it carefully. We make it known that Robert is back, but we control the narrative. And we're ready for any fallout that comes our way." Robert smiled, a glint of triumph in his eyes. "That's all I needed to hear." Pale, his eyes wide with shock. "What?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Lillian took a step forward. "He was never certain, and I don't know if it's true. But I thought you should know, because it's part of why he resented the Lancaster family so much. He believed he was denied a family of his own." Edward looked at Robert, his face a mixture of disbelief and sorrow. Could Lawrence's vendetta have stemmed from such a personal wound, such a twisted notion of loyalty and betrayal? Robert swallowed hard, his expression torn between anger and sadness. "I don't know what to say," or what to believe. Lillian met his gaze with an intensity that conveyed both her pain and her conviction. I don't need anything from you. I just wanted to tell you the truth, or at least the truth as my father believed it. You deserve to know. A long silence followed before Edward finally spoke, his voice firm yet compassionate. Thank you, Lillian. We'll need time to process this, but you did the right thing by coming forward. With a nod, Lillian turned to leave, pausing at the doorway to cast one last glance at Robert. Whatever the truth is, you have a family here, Robert. Don't let the past steal any more from you than it already has. After she left, Robert sank into a chair, his face etched with confusion and grief. Edward and Leo sat beside him, offering silent support as he grappled with the possibility of a heritage he had never known. But even as Robert wrestled with the truth of his own identity, the Lancaster family's unity held strong. The revelation that Robert might be Lawrence Hayes' son rippled through the Lancaster family, leaving each of them shaken in a different way. Edward, who had dedicated himself to keeping the Lancaster name untarnished, now faced the possibility that his brother's very identity might be entwined with their family's greatest betrayer. For Robert, the shock was profound. He felt adrift, as though his place in the family he had fought so hard to reclaim might have been based on a lie. But as days passed, they resolved to confront the uncertainty head-on. They needed answers, and only one person could provide them: Lawrence himself. Edward arranged for a visit to the prison where Lawrence was being held. He and Robert prepared themselves for what might be the most difficult conversation of their lives, one that could change everything they thought they knew about their family. Leo, though conflicted, decided to come along, determined to support his father and uncle no matter what the truth turned out to be. As they arrived at the prison, the three of them were led down a long, dimly lit corridor, the cold echo of their footsteps emphasizing the gravity of their mission. At the end of the hall, in a small, windowless room, Lawrence Hayes was waiting. Lawrence was a shadow of his former self, his once arrogant posture now slouched, his face lined with bitterness. But when he saw Edward and Robert, a flicker of defiance returned to his eyes. Well, Lawrence drawled, his voice laced with disdain. To what do I owe the pleasure? Edward didn't waste time on pleasantries. We're here because of your daughter. She came to us with information about Robert's parentage. Lawrence's smirk faded slightly, and he leaned back, assessing them. So, Lillian finally told you, did she? Robert stepped forward, his voice shaking but determined. Is it true? Am I your son? Lawrence's gaze shifted to Robert, and for the first time, a glimmer of something almost resembling remorse crossed his face. I don't know, Robert. I never knew for certain. Your mother, she and I, we had an affair, yes? But whether or not you're my son, that's something only she could answer. A wave of anger surged through Robert. You built a vendetta against our family based on nothing but a possibility? You stole years of my life, fractured my family, and for what? Some twisted notion that I might have been yours. Lawrence's expression hardened. You don't understand, Robert. I loved your mother, and she chose your father, chose the Lancaster name over me. It destroyed me. I was left with nothing while Edward inherited everything. Edward clenched his fists, his voice cold. You betrayed us over a grudge that you twisted into an obsession, corrupting everything we built, everything we believed in. Lawrence's face contorted, his bitterness raw and unmasked. Yes, I wanted you to suffer. I wanted the Lancaster name to be tainted, to lose the power it wielded over me, over her. She may have chosen your family, Edward, but in the end, her legacy was as compromised as mine. Robert took a deep, shuddering breath, his eyes never leaving Lawrence's. And you didn't care what damage you left in your wake. I lost my family, my life, because of you. Lawrence's face softened just slightly, a flicker of regret in his eyes. I don't expect forgiveness, Robert, but perhaps now you'll understand that everything I did was born from the pain your mother caused me. Edward, his voice taut with anger, stepped forward. You used her as an excuse for your own ambition. You betrayed every principle she stood for. Lawrence's bitterness returned, a hardened gleam in his eye. Principles? Your family was built on ruthless alliances and power plays, Edward. Don't pretend you're any different from me." For a long moment, Edward didn't respond. But then his face softened, and he met Lawrence's gaze with a calm resolve. "Maybe once we were similar, but not anymore. We've chosen a different path, and whatever power you thought you held over us is gone." Lawrence sneered. "So you think. But legacies are funny things, Edward. They have a way of persisting, of seeping into everything, no matter how hard you try to clean them up." Edward stared at him for a moment, feeling a strange sense of pity for the man who had once been their family's friend. "That's where you're wrong, Lawrence. Legacies are built, not inherited. And we've already started building something better." Lawrence's sneer faltered, replaced by a flicker of doubt. But before he could respond, Edward, Robert, and Leo turned and left, the finality of their departure a statement louder than any words. The drive back to the Lancaster estate was somber, each of them lost in their own thoughts. Lawrence had given them no definitive answers, only a vague confirmation of their suspicions. But for Robert, it was enough. Back at the mansion, Robert retreated to the study, the weight of Lawrence's confession pressing down on him. Edward found him there, seated by the window, staring into the gardens with a look of profound sadness. "Are you all right?" Edward asked, his voice gentle. Robert looked up, his expression weary. "I don't know. All these years, I thought I knew who I was, where I came from. But now, it's as if everything has been turned upside down." Edward placed a hand on his brother's shoulder. "Blood doesn't define family, Robert. You're my brother, and that hasn't changed. Whatever Lawrence thought or believed, it doesn't change what you mean to me, or to this family." Robert's face softened, and he nodded, gratitude in his eyes. "Thank you, Edward. I needed to hear that." Just then, Leo entered, a tentative smile on his face. "Uncle Robert, Dad's right. You're part of this family, and no secret or lie from the past can change that. You belong here with us." Robert looked at his nephew, the lines of worry easing from his face. "Thank you, Leo. That means more than you know." They sat together in quiet solidarity, the three of them bound not only by blood, but by choice. A choice to rebuild their family, to reshape the Lancaster name in a way that honored the best parts of their legacy while rejecting the darkness that had plagued them. Days passed, and the Lancaster family resumed their lives with a renewed sense of purpose. The Lancaster Trust had begun to take shape, with each of them playing a role in guiding it forward. Edward oversaw the initial operations, ensuring that each project aligned with their new values. Leo took on a larger role, visiting charities, meeting with community leaders, and developing a reputation as a Lancaster with integrity. And Robert, too, found a place within the trust. He used his own experiences, his struggles, and his resilience to inspire others, helping to build a program within the trust that provided support to individuals and families in need, people who had lost their way but were searching for a new beginning. One evening, as they gathered for a family dinner, the first they'd had in years without the shadow of past betrayals hanging over them, Edward raised a glass, looking at his son and his brother with pride. "To the Lancasters," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "To family, to forgiveness, and to the future." They clinked glasses, each of them feeling the weight of the past finally lift, replaced by a shared commitment to the legacy they were building together. As the night wore on, laughter filled the halls of the Lancaster mansion, mingling with the warmth of reconciliation and the promise of a brighter tomorrow. Edward felt a profound peace settle over him, a sense that his life's purpose had finally aligned with something true, something good. For the first time, he looked at his family and felt not just relief, but hope. A hope that the Lancasters, reborn and unburdened, would endure as a testament to resilience, integrity, and the power of choosing one's own path. And as they toasted to the future, Edward knew that, whatever challenges lay ahead, the Lancaster family was ready to face them together. Months passed, and the Lancaster family settled into their transformed legacy with a quiet sense of satisfaction. The Lancaster Trust, once an ambitious idea, had become a reality, impacting lives across the city. The name that once evoked power and intimidation now inspired respect and hope. Edward, Robert, and Leo had found a rhythm in their new roles, each contributing their strengths to the trust. Edward, still sharp and discerning, led the trust with wisdom, focusing on projects that would have a lasting impact. Robert, in his newfound purpose, dedicated himself to mentoring young people, guiding those who faced the kind of struggles he had endured. Leo, ever passionate and energetic, worked to innovate, finding new ways to expand the trust's influence in education and the arts. One crisp autumn afternoon, as Edward strolled through the Lancaster Gardens with Robert, a letter arrived that would bring their journey full circle. It was from Lillian Hayes, Lawrence's daughter. She had stayed away from the family since revealing the possibility of Robert's true parentage, but her words were thoughtful, almost apologetic. Dear Edward, Robert, and Leo, I wanted to thank you for your kindness in hearing my story and in allowing me to speak my truth. I've been doing some soul-searching since our last meeting, and I felt it was time to extend an olive branch. I know my father's actions left deep wounds, and that his pursuit of revenge inflicted scars on all of us. But I've come to realize that I, too, am a part of this complicated legacy. My father's choices don't define me, just as they don't define you. If you would allow it, I'd like to meet one more time. I'd like to talk about a future where our paths are no longer at odds, but aligned in the shared goal of doing good. With respect, Lillian Hayes. The letter was unexpected, and Edward found himself wondering about this young woman who had lost her father to the same ambitions that had once plagued the Lancaster family. After discussing it with Robert and Leo, they decided to meet her. They invited Lillian to the mansion, where they welcomed her with a warmth she had not expected. Seated around a table in the sunlit dining room, Edward, Robert, and Leo listened as Lillian explained her desire to atone for her father's legacy and to work alongside the Lancaster Trust. She expressed a sincere admiration for the changes they had made, and a genuine wish to honor the part of her that yearned to do good. Robert listened intently, and when she finished, he reached across the table and placed a hand on hers, giving a gentle, understanding nod. Lillian, whatever the truth is about our connection, I want you to know that you have a place here. The past may be complicated, but you deserve the chance to make your own future, just as we have. Moved, Lillian nodded, and the uncertainty between them faded, replaced by an unspoken understanding. For Edward and Leo, it felt like the last piece of a puzzle finally falling into place. With Lillian on board, the trust gained a new dimension. She brought with her insights into the darker side of wealth and influence, guiding the family in avoiding the pitfalls of power and in building alliances that would protect the integrity of the Lancaster name. Over the next year, the Lancaster Trust grew, evolving into a pillar of the community. They established scholarships, founded art programs for underprivileged children, and sponsored medical facilities, each project a testament to the family's transformation. Edward felt the pride of a man who had finally found the true purpose of his life's work. Then, one day, as Edward walked the grounds of the estate, he saw Leo working with a group of young students. Leo was teaching them about the history of the Lancaster family, not the myths of power and prestige, but the real journey of redemption and resilience. The sight filled Edward with a joy he could scarcely describe. Later that evening, Edward gathered everyone in the study for a quiet celebration. The Lancaster mansion, once a fortress of solitude and ambition, now echoed with laughter and conversation. It was a simple gathering, just Edward, Robert, Leo, and Lillian. But to Edward, it felt like the greatest triumph of all. As the fire crackled in the hearth, Edward raised his glass. To family, he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. Not the kind bound by blood alone, but by choice, by values, and by love. They clinked glasses, each of them smiling, each of them aware of how far they had come. The legacy that they had forged together was one born from struggle and redemption, but most importantly, it was a legacy they had chosen. Robert, who had spent so many years isolated from his family, leaned back in his chair, a look of profound peace on his face. I never imagined coming back here would lead to this, he said softly, glancing around the room at the family he had reclaimed. But I am grateful every day that it did. Leo nodded, his face full of determination and pride. We've done something that feels real, something that will last. And that's worth more than all the wealth in the world. Lillian smiled, her eyes bright with emotion. Thank you for letting me be a part of this. I know my father's legacy is something I'll always have to live with, but because of you, I've found a way to build my own." Edward's heart swelled with pride as he looked at each of them, feeling the fulfillment of a journey that had spanned generations. "This is the legacy," he said, his voice steady. "Not wealth, not power, but family, trust, and the promise that what we leave behind will make the world better." As the evening drew on, the Lancasters and Lillian stayed together, talking, reminiscing, and dreaming of the future. For the first time in Edward's life, he felt that the Lancaster name had become something worth cherishing, not because of its power, but because of the love and unity that now defined it. In the weeks that followed, the Lancaster Trust expanded further, branching out into initiatives that inspired hope and progress. The Lancaster name, once associated with dominance and intimidation, had been reborn in the hearts of the community. The family's story became one of inspiration, a tale of redemption that people shared with pride. And as Edward looked back on the path that had led them here, he knew that this was the ending he had always hoped for, an ending that was not really an ending at all, but a beginning for generations to come. One afternoon, as Edward sat by the garden overlooking the lush grounds of the estate, Leo joined him, carrying an old leather-bound book. He handed it to Edward, who opened it to find a collection of family photos, images of their journey, their struggles, and their victories. The final page held a quote Leo had written, a quote that encapsulated the family's journey. "A legacy isn't defined by wealth or power, but by the hearts it touches and the lives it changes. The Lancaster name will live on, not because of what we had, but because of what we gave." Edward looked at his son, pride swelling within him. "You're ready, Leo," he said quietly, "ready to take the Lancaster name forward." Leo smiled, nodding. "Because you showed me how, Dad. And we'll make sure it's a legacy worth remembering." As Edward closed the book, he felt a deep sense of peace. The journey had been long and filled with hardship, but it had brought them here, to a place where the Lancaster name meant something greater than power. It meant family, resilience, and above all, hope. And as the sun set over the Lancaster estate, casting a golden glow over the gardens, Edward knew that the legacy they had rebuilt would stand strong, a beacon for all who followed. Together, they had reclaimed their story, and the Lancaster name would endure, not as a monument to ambition, but as a testament to love, redemption, and the courage to choose one's own path.